This is a rather personal tribute. I want to thank a variety of people, Rian and Daniel, for inviting me. They may live to regret it. Doug's wife and his children, and people in Oxford, and others who are listed there. This is Doug in 2014 at a Science in Transition symposium in Utrecht. This is how many of us remember him in recent years. His background, you can read there, born and early education in North London, and he was quite precocious to start with, but around the time of A-levels, he struggled a bit. And he repeated a year, and he didn't have an immediate success, and was one of the first people to actually study a degree in statistics rather than in mathematics. He graduated and started at St. Thomas's Medical School, and it was just around the time he left there that I first knew him. And he then went to the MRC in Northwick Park, and then to the Imperial, as it was then, Cancer Research Fund back in central London, and then to the Oxford Centre for Statistics in Medicine. And he became a professor in 1998. I'm going to try and go fairly quickly. There's a funny story around that if you really want to know, you can ask me about afterwards. But here was Doug in his early years, right? When I was asked to give this talk, I decided that in tribute to him, I would first of all not wear a tie, which those of you who know me, I normally wear a tie, and I'm not wearing a tie. But I also decided I wouldn't grow my hair. I wouldn't cut my hair from the time I was invited, but of course I haven't managed anything like Doug has done. He had a delightful family, and this is a picture of them probably on a cycling holiday. And Sue, his wife, says they were together for 33 happy years. And his grandparents had emigrated to London at the turn of the 20th century from 4 different countries in Eastern Europe. I don't know he didn't ever discuss Brexit with him, but I don't think we need to say what his views were. I've emulated Doug in writing my talk, finally, sitting down outside this room, and he was just great in that. His daughter, Louise, when he died, there was a Twitter storm, and a number of you will have contributed to that. Hetton Shah said some very nice things there, David Spiegelhalter and others did. But the recurring theme was how modest Doug was. And also, she added that lots of us knew him from this. When you found a good place to eat, you had to traipse around for another half hour looking at 5 further restaurants before returning to the first. But the thing that was quite surprising to a lot of us was quite practical and great at DIY he was. His son Ed said that he loved to cycle, and he said, and I'm inspired by that, love you to remember him with his passions and his quirks, and that's what I'm here to do. He had roles in the RSS. I guess I knew him particularly around the medical section, where his enthusiasm for the Natraj Nepali restaurant after medical section meetings was legendary. But the indecision over the menu meant that I had in my filofax in those days, I had a list of the standard order for a medical section, post-medical section meeting to avoid any indecisions over the menu, and I would give that surreptitiously to the waiter while everyone dithered. We can talk about Doug's work and his achievements. I said to Tim Cole before this meeting that we could actually have a whole conference on Doug's achievements. We could have the whole of this conference, and probably another one as well on what Doug has done. And one of the key things is his encouragement of people. So his early work, he had from 1977 issues that are echoed in what John said just now about issues of poor statistics in medical papers. And his first papers that really took off were the Statistics and Ethics series. And his view essentially was that it is unethical to use statistics badly, and that can influence hundreds, if not thousands, of patients. And the surgeon who behaves unethically probably only affects a handful of patients. And he noted rather later that the first 20 years of his career, he worked on clinical data. And I think that was an important background. He got to know what clinicians were doing. He really got to understand what their issues were. And a key thing was that he joined the BMJ Hanging Committee in 1987, which had been set up by Stephen Locke with Martin Gardner. And Martin Gardner, the late Martin Gardner, another of our great heroes, was the person who was on the Hanging Committee. And when he couldn't go, Stephen Locke decided he needed someone else, and so Doug started going there. He got into reporting guidelines in the British Medical Journal and in other places, and reporting on things was quite important to him. Big influences were Dave Sackett, who he met at St. Thomas's early on, Donald Mainland. How many of you have not heard of Donald Mainland? Wow, that's fantastic. You're really going to come away from this learning something. Donald Mainland was a surgeon who became a statistician, and he wrote a wonderful book on elementary medical statistics. I've had 2 copies of mine stolen. It's out of print. So if any of you have got them, I want them back. And the first one who brings it, if a second one does, can keep the one of them. I only want one. But Feinstein wrote about Donald Mainland. He published some wonderful things in the end of his life in the British Medical Journal and said that he could be succeeded but not replaced. That would be my theme for Doug. He may be succeeded, he will not be replaced. But the key element was, and again, echoes of this came in what John Pullinger said a few minutes ago, is that statistical thinking is always more important than statistical arithmetic. I don't think this comes out terribly well in this lighting here. Doug published with over 1,600 different co-authors. And this is a word cloud, and you'll see Dave Mower in the middle there, Martin Bland down the bottom here, I don't know, and Ken Schultz are the 3 people he published most with. And there's a vast array of people, some of them perhaps in this room, who he published with. I'm way down the list. Here's some of the fields in which he published: medicine, healthcare, oncology, obstetrics, mathematical computational biology, surgery, respiratory pathology, and so on. Those are just some of the fields in which he published. Am I allowed to say what you told me, Tim, about the J index? Thank you. Tim Cole has invented a J index. Lots of you have heard of the H index, H being the number of papers you have published with at least H citations. J is the number of journals you've published in with at least J papers in that journal. And that's a number that's very difficult to get. Doug's H index is well over 200. His J index is only 15. I don't know what yours is. Mine's probably only about 2 or 3. He published in all these fields, but he also published in a vast array of countries. Enormous number of countries he had fellow authors from. He published a paper in 1986 in The Lancet on method comparison. And there were other papers that he published around that. A slightly corrected version appears in an Italian journal. And that's where the definitive paper appears. But that didn't get cited nearly as often, but also published in the Statistician and so on. And this was about how people made method comparisons, and he did it with Martin Bland. And Martin Bland should, of course, be giving this talk, but he's in Australia, and he can't give it. And the two of them have published 100 papers together. I shouldn't think there's 100 people in this room who've published 100 papers, but they published 100 together and were working on 101. And that was a more recent picture of the two of them, looking very similar in many ways, but a slight reduction in hair and a change in tonal quality. That paper had 30,000 citations according to the Web of Science and 40,000 according to Google. And Martin pointed out to me that Google is not the right thing to rely on. And so I thought I'd look at Doug's papers, or a number of them, and look at the correlation between the number of citations on the Web of Science and Google Scholar. And they look really beautifully related, of course. And the method comparison paper is out there at the right-hand side, 30,000 or 40,000. And there's an outlier there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But of course, you shouldn't do that. You should use the Bland and Altman method. And if you do that on a linear scale, that's what it looks like, and there's the limits of agreement. And we've still got this outlier there. That's one of the Prisma papers where in Google they have been coalesced, because the Consort and Prisma papers are often simultaneously published in up to 7 journals. And Web of Science doesn't coalesce them, and Google does. And so it isn't a fair comparison to include that, and so I'm going to exclude it as an outlier. Elsewhere in the biometric bulletin, you can read that Doug himself is an outlier in almost every way possible. So when you do it and you take logs, you do that. That's Martin Bland's favorite. He always said, all statistical consulting says to the person who comes through your door, take logs and do a t-test. So when you take logs and remove the outlier, there's where you get the limits of agreement. And you can see that there is an average of about 0.4 on a log scale, and if you read one of Doug's things, about that sort of level. A lot of variability, but Google is consistently above Web of Science, and you could say it's about 40% higher. So you need to ameliorate your numbers when you quote your citations there. But Doug said the thing he was most proud of was writing a textbook. It's easy to start one, but extremely difficult to finish. I would agree with that. My son told me when I was asked to write a book on something, he said, oh no, another empty directory on the computer. But that's gone on being published from 1990 and still being used and still being bought. It's amazing. And he published other things on confidence intervals with Martin Gardner in the BMJ, and then a book with Martin that appeared just before Martin died, and second edition that appeared later. He's published on systematic reviews, writing books there in more than one edition. And an important thing was a collaboration between Dave Mower, who's at the top left here, and Ken Schultz. He was the co-supervisor of Ken Schultz's PhD, and that looked particularly at empirical evidence of bias in randomized trials. But the first part of his quote there is effectively emphasizing that statistical arithmetic and being terribly pedantic over the exact statistical method is not as important as the wider contextual issues, and bias from selective publication is going to be much more important. And Dave has said that he, in introducing people, says that anyone who hasn't heard of Doug is an alien from another planet, and he was very modest about his achievements. But he told me about one thing that Doug was very keen on. He has wonderful sets of lists. He had a list of every peer review he'd ever done, which was thousands and thousands, just amazing. And so they ended up publishing this paper in JAMA on empirical evidence of bias based on Ken Schultz's PhD, and it won a CDC award. And Ken said of Doug, he's always fun to be with, and the biometric bulletin I referred to remarks on his infectious laugh. And he was logical and rational and calm, and he could get people in collaborating groups like Consort to draw them to consensus. John Ioannidis, another giant of our age, he says Doug Altman was a giant. And he says, I want to remember a man who shed so much light on so many misconceptions. I'm in great debt to him. And that led on to a lot more than just the Consort guidelines, the Equator Network with all these guidelines for trials and observational studies, and moving into guidelines for conducting them rather than just reporting them. He worked with Patrick Royston for a long time, 10 methodological papers and citations, a minimum of 350 up to 2,900. You know, it just shames most of us to have that kind of number. A joint red RSS paper on regression using fractional polynomials cited many hundreds of times. It was really pleasing to know that last year in March there was a celebration of 20 years of outstanding contributions to health research by Doug. And one of the key people in that was Samir Gray, who funded the Cochrane collaboration essentially, and Oxford got that going, got the Centre for Statistics in Medicine. And I hope you can see that wonderful laugh of Doug at that moment. That was sent to me there. That was Doug laughing. There's some idiot bending down in the front there, but there we go. And again, echoing what John said, we should be angry when we see statistical nonsense, whether in journals or in the mass media, and he was saying this in 2017. Stephen Locke, the editor of the BMJ, says that he needs to be in the Dictionary of National Biography. He was such a great influence. And Richard Smith said he did more to improve the publishing of science than any other individual, and he told him that just before he died. Fiona Godley says that her decision-making turned from stressful to delightful by knowing we had Doug to guide us. George Davy Smith has this wonderful phrase. He sounds so positive, it would take a while for you to realize he was gently explaining to you a fundamental flaw he'd instantly spotted. He was such a lovely guy for that. Two of my colleagues at the School of Hygiene who are quite young, who are working on the record guidelines for reporting in electronic health record data. And he shared his immense wisdom with them, again, subtly letting us know when we were wrong without seeming to criticize, and helping young people, and they were so pleased that Doug gave them support, despite their being very junior in years and knowledge. Jeff Aronson, known to many of you, a clinical pharmacologist, and he noted the Twitter things and said that he had, somebody said, I can't find out who it was, said he had geniusness. And Jeff, who's an expert on words, pointed out that this isn't found to be in any dictionary. So what does it mean? It's a portmanteau word. It means two things, genius plus generousness. And that was Doug, a genius who was generous. He was an ambassador for statistics to the world. I tried my own portmanteau word, which isn't quite as good perhaps, but there we go. Our profession and this society owes him so much. Many patients who've never heard of him and never will have benefited and will benefit in the future. We all miss him. Martin Bland said, I am bereft. I'm going to ask you now to do something that is perhaps a little unusual. I'm going to ask you to sit for a few seconds and think about your response to what Doug has done. And then I'm going to ask you to stand for a little short while in silence in respect for him. And then I'm going to start clapping him, and I'm going to cheer, and I may even cry, and I'd ask you to show your applause after that as well. If you're able to, will you please stand? Doug, we honor you.